And firstly, welcome to the ASPG Victoria's fourth and final public seminar for 2023, but we can promise more to come next year. We just had our AGM before the public seminar, and so we have another executive to move forward into the new year. Most of us are returning to do that again. And look, before commencing formal seminar proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this Parliament House sits and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Andrew Young and I'm the Chair of the Victorian Chapter, and on behalf of the whole Executive I'm pleased to open the session and welcome you here. So I'd like to just briefly remind everyone, as I tend to do at these seminars, what the ASPG group is, and again thank the Parliament for being the venue for our chapter activities. It's greatly appreciated. So the Australasian Study of Parliament Group is a not-for-profit apolitical entity and includes state and territory chapters. Membership is open to all. The chapter's objectives include providing forums such as this seminar, informing and educating the public about Parliament and contributing to the process of reform and improvement of parliamentary institutions and legislative processes. The ASPG also has an important purpose of promoting high-level research and writing, and at the national level the ASPG publishes this Australian Parliamentary Review journal, which is overseen by an editorial board and standards of academic integrity. Sally, you've probably had an article in it before, I think. So if you are not a member and are interested in doing so, please come and see us after the seminar for more information. Or, Rachel, if I'm not wrong, there's a poster. Where is it? There's a QR code outside, which you can scan, and Rachel's down the back there. You can also talk to her about membership if you're interested in joining. Please note that the seminar is being recorded, and I again thank the Parliament crew for doing that and helping us out. It's really appreciated. They do a great job. If you've got any concerns about the recording, see us at the end of the seminar. We don't live stream, we record and publish later. The theme of electoral commissions, their vital role and the political, social media and other contexts in which they operate in support of a healthy democracy, is a theme which the ASPG Executive identified at the start of the year, long before we knew there was going to be a referendum held just before the seminar. It's a coincidence that the seminar has come so quickly on the heels of the referendum, and we've not designed the session to be about the referendum, albeit many of the issues that we will discuss are likely to be relevant to the referendum, just as they are relevant to other elections and functions of electoral commissions. I raise that coincidence because Nye Coffey from the AEC, who I'll introduce in a moment, may not even be able to comment about a couple of things, because Nye, I think it's right that the writ hasn't been returned yet, is that right?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. So that's probably a surprise to many of us, as it was to me when Nye mentioned it the other day. The writ hasn't yet been returned because you've still been counting. Also in these seminars we like to avoid concentrating too much on individual controversies, so I'll ask that you keep this in mind when we get to time for questions later. So on to the panel. Firstly, in alphabetical order, to my immediate left, Sven Bluemmel was appointed Victorian Electoral Commissioner in August 2023. He previously served as the inaugural Victorian Information Commissioner. He was the Western Australian Information Commissioner and has held senior positions in the Western Australian and Commonwealth public sectors. He practiced law in private sector in Melbourne and Perth in the areas of information and privacy law. He's a Fellow of Leadership at Western Australia and served as President of the Institute of Public Administration in Western Australia for 3 years. He has a Bachelor of Laws with honours and a Bachelor of Science from both from the ANU. At the other end of the table, following in alphabetical order, is Nye Coffey. Nye is the Australian Electoral Officer for Victoria and State Manager for the Australian Electoral Commission. Since joining the AEC in 2018, Nye has undertaken a range of roles for the agency across a wide range of electoral operations, which included delivering the Eden-Monaro by-election, which was the first federal event delivered in the pandemic, when I think you performed that as Assistant Commissioner Elections. And you delivered the 2022 federal election and the 2023 referendum as State Manager for Victoria. Prior to the AEC, Nye worked in the events sector, delivering major public events including Sydney's New Year's Eve, so a different kind of fireworks from elections, and the Spirit of Anzac Centenary experience. And Sally Young in the middle. Sally is Professor of Australian Politics and Media at University of Melbourne. Her latest book is titled Media Monsters, The Transformation of Australia's Newspaper Empires, which was published in June as the sequel to her award-winning book, Paper Emperors. Sally has also written books on election reporting and political advertising, as well as journal articles on compulsory voting, informal voting, political donations and media policy. She's been a research committee member at the Centre for Public Integrity since 2019, contributing expert advice on research aimed at strengthening Australian democracy. Welcome to all three of you, and thank you again for giving up your time. So we're going to range across a number of themes, and the first one is that of public engagement and access to the electoral system. So, Sven, perhaps if I can start with you and ask what sort of challenges the VEC deals with, and perhaps how you think about and help those who may be, for instance, homeless, or those with language and other barriers, or people who are going to face other challenges accessing the electoral system.
Yeah, thank you very much. What we do starts from the premise that our democracy just has to be for everyone. Now, that's really easy to say, it's really straightforward, but it actually matters. And if you think of maybe some systems outside of Australia, you can see what happens when that isn't true, when it's not even professed to be true, let alone lived. And so therefore, in Australia, of course, we've got compulsory voting, or as I like to really refer to it, compulsory showing up. Because you don't have to cast a valid vote, but you do have to show up. And on the one hand, that can sort of be looked at as saying, well, if we've got the law there to do that, why do we need to engage people? It's the law, you've all got to comply with the law, so, show up, it's your problem, otherwise we'll prosecute. Now, that to me would be a very sad state of affairs, because I actually think the fact that we've got compulsory voting, compulsory showing up, is even more reason for us to be engaging. Not just engaging in terms of removing obstacles, because if the law says you've got to do it and then there are practical obstacles in your way, then that is a very inherently unfair situation. So we've got to remove those things. But I think one of the things that we do as a great priority is to say, well, we want people to want to do it as well. And so when what we do is we don't just do that, and I'm sure the Nye and the AEC as well similarly, is that we don't just think our obligation for engagement is triggered just before an election and finishes on election day. That's now for us a constant. 4 years between electoral cycle state, 4 years between local, it's got to be constant. So we actually have ongoing mechanisms where we engage with First Nations people, prisoners, young people, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, homeless people or people in precarious situations like that, people suffering from or under the threat of family violence. So we do all of that, and that's why we do it, for all the reasons I said at the outset. It's got to be something that isn't just an obligation. We want people to be able to do it, but we want people to want to be able to do it as well, which is a bit harder. But I feel pretty confident about that.
Nye, Sally?
Yeah, I agree 100% with what Sven's said there. We have compulsory enrolment and compulsory voting in Australia. But as Sven said, if we're relying on that, then we're in a pretty poor place. And sometimes I look at some of the systems overseas with some envy, where you can predict where people are going to turn up, places that have precinct voting and so forth, which sometimes would make actually preparing those locations for voters so much easier if we knew where people were going to turn up. But it's that interplay with it being compulsory that makes it so important that you can, in Australia, pretty well show up anywhere in the country. In a federal election, you can be anywhere around the country and go to a polling place and vote and vote formally. And I think that's really, really important. I think the other part of this, just riffing a little bit off the ongoing piece that Sven mentioned, is a kind of civics education is probably not quite what we'd all love it to be in this country. And I was reflecting after we did a series of education sessions with the Victorian Multicultural Council, Commission, that in a lot of senses, new citizens actually have a lot more information about the voting process and civics than most Australians do. And so I think that's probably the missing gap for us in terms of building that overall awareness. We do a lot of things around specific cohorts similar to the VEC, and we do a lot of that stuff with the VEC. But I think a more broader piece around civics may even assist with some of the other themes that we're talking about this evening.
Thanks. Sally.
Yeah, just picking up on a few of the themes that have already been touched on. So compulsory voting, I think, is absolutely essential to Australia being the democracy that it is, and into the future I hope that that's something that we all try to protect. I think any time that is proposals to tinker with that should always be viewed with utmost suspicion. It has protected us from a lot of the worst things that we see overseas. It has meant that we have to make elections and voting accessible, that we have this inherent responsibility to do that. As you say, it's not fair to ask people to vote and then to put obstacles in their way. We only have to look at the United States, where they have elections on a Tuesday, generally during working hours, to know that, and long queues for polling stations, which they can put in the most inappropriate places, and all sorts of obstacles that are put in the way, to know how precious our system is and how well designed it is generally. And in terms of who votes and why they vote, I agree that civics education, this has been said so many times over so many years, that we don't have good enough civics education, and I'll say it again for the record, it's been said so many times, but in Australian schools we know that in most schools now, there's not Australian politics anymore. That's been taken off the table. Even when it was there, it was very poorly taken up, and Australian history as well is not well taken up as a separate unit. It's much more glamorous to study, and I would choose it too, to be honest, revolutions, or why would you study Australian history when you can study something like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution? But these are topics that are not well chosen: Australian history, Australian politics, but they're absolutely essential to all of these sorts of activities that we ask people to do. And getting information to people, and I know we'll get onto this topic, but about voting and why we vote and how the process works is absolutely essential. And overseas, when you talk to people, Australia is known as a world leader for so many initiatives. They call it the Australian ballot, the secret ballot overseas. They'll call it the Australian ballot, and that's something that we have a long, proud history of making voting as accessible as possible. And I think we just have to keep protecting that. We know that there are forces that would try and wind some of these initiatives back, and we have to be ever vigilant to make sure that that doesn't happen. And we've seen proposals over the year, for example, voter ID and all sorts of things put into the mix that might sound, simple enough, but everything that we put in the way, as you say, I can show up anywhere in the country and get my name marked off on a roll and they'll find me. It should be absolutely as easy as possible, and at the moment it really is world leading.
Perhaps if I can be a bit cheeky and ask you, Nye and Sven, you've made the point that although we have compulsory voting or compulsory showing up, as you said, Sven, you still actively try and make sure you've got the participation. So to what extent do you take that to the point of even setting targets which may be internal, that we don't know about, or are known externally for actual turn up? And are you sort of seeing any particular trends in recent years, or have you got a problem there? Or a challenge, perhaps, is a better way to put it.
Participation is always a challenge, and it's a little bit of an interplay between enrolment and voting as well. So we've got the most comprehensive roll that we've had in history. 98% complete, we estimate. That is a modern miracle of elections. And people talk about turnout and participation purely in terms of going and getting your name marked off, but participation is also being on the roll, and having a complete roll is something that you cannot take for granted. When we look around the world and the efforts that are made to actually take people off roles or prevent people from being on the roll, it is something that we take very seriously. So with that 98% completion, to get those sorts of numbers, we've been doing a lot of work, particularly around federal direct enrolment update, where we data match with other agencies, including state government agencies like driver's licences and so forth, and we update people's enrolment based on that, and we enrol people based on that. There are checks and balances around it. But what it means is that there's a lot of people who we are now getting onto the roll who don't want to be on the roll. They never had any intention of participating in the process, and suddenly, because they need to have a driver's licence or, change their address with Centrelink or something like that, we've suddenly found them and we've put them on the roll, which leads to a turnout and participation problem at the other end, because those people were never intending on turning out. Now, there's a proportion of those who will basically turn up to avoid the fine. Hopefully they don't know it's $20. And then there is a proportion of those that you're just not going to move that dial on. So we do a lot of work on, I guess, personas of different segments of electors to work out what the messages to go to them are going to be best. And for some of them, the compliance is actually the best message for some people. It's probably not the biggest group, but yeah, so we don't have targets, but it's never enough.
Yeah. Sven?
Well, I'm really glad that the fines in Victoria are much higher, which is, I think, something we want to preserve. Or bring yours up so that they're equal, that'd be great too. We've actually really benefited from the AEC's work, particularly in the lead up to the referendum, in terms of getting that coverage of the roll much, much higher than it's ever been. And obviously that flows through to the Victorian roll as well, Register of Electors as well, which is great. To your question, do we have a problem or a challenge there? I think, yeah, we've definitely got a challenge there, but it's a challenge that I think is almost an inherent part of the process, and we mustn't get complacent about it. So yes, all of those things, like there's the enforcement side of things, but then there's also the positive side of things of removing barriers, encouragement, and so on. And we keep very a close eye on the data, as the AEC and our counterparts elsewhere do, about which cohorts are the ones that have lower turnout rates, and then focus on the area there. And just one other thing I'd add, in terms of whether people are turning up to just avoid the fine or whatever it might be, we've done some. Well, we're currently in the process of doing some, I think it's world-leading research on informality and informal voting. So from the last state election, we actually had some researchers going through ballot papers and seeing all the informal ballot papers and categorising them into categories of, firstly, primarily distinguishing between intentionally informal and unintentionally informal, which is something you can do fairly reliably. Unintentionally is you do the numbers and you skip one or something like that. Intentional is pretty obvious, including the category that we call the usual anatomical drawings, which are not many, by the way. There's not many of those. There's not as many as you think. And of course, if you do one of those and your ballot is otherwise valid, it'll still count. But those sorts of things. But then we have perhaps people from other backgrounds where, ticks, crosses, just numbering one box, circling something, all of those sorts of things, which seem to be unintentional. So that gives us a good insight into that as well. And obviously, we'll share all of that wherever we possibly can. So all of that is intelligence for us as to where we focus our efforts and how we can focus those efforts to keep that turnout rate as high as possible and drive it higher if we can. Yes.
Yeah. Sally, if you wanted to, yeah.
This might be taking this slightly different direction, but I think in terms of what we were talking about before in voting, one thing that's clearly happening is that Australians are changing how they want to vote. So before we told them to come along on a Saturday, they went to their local primary school or wherever the polling booth was, and they voted there in person. And now we're getting a lot more postal votes and a lot more pre-poll, and people don't want to come on the Saturday and they worry there might be a queue, and so they'd rather go, even though there are queues at the pre-poll centres as well. But they're changing how they want to vote, and that has been happening sort of from the bottom up. It's not like the government or anybody has changed and said, vote these ways instead. People are doing it because they want to vote that way, and we've sort of gone with that. And I sometimes wonder, thinking about the sort of consequences of that, because there was something about voting in person where we could all sort of see people traipsing in, and it has a lot of spin-off effects like the democracy sausage, and it's good for the local schools, and you get a sense of community, and it gives you that sense of we're all sort of one purpose here and on this particular day. But that's sort of happened by stealth, and I wonder what the implications are of that, and whether that because it's sort of come from the bottom up rather than someone designing it, what that might mean. But it's sort of an indication of how Australians feel about voting as well. Yeah.
Nice.
So I might just comment on that, because there's a couple of interesting pieces in that. We now basically have 50% of the electorate vote early, roughly, rather than on the day. And there's a real interplay here because... or not interplay, a tension here, because I think many of the other stakeholders in elections are not particularly keen on the rise of early voting. It requires additional staff from us. It requires campaigns to have staff at those polling places. So there's this real tension between what might be, electors are, pardon the pun, voting with their feet. They're saying this is how we want to vote, but there's also this other tension of actually it's not actually that great. I would say pre-poll voting is probably less of a challenge than postal voting in terms of that trend and that move. We put out a message as much as we can that elections are fundamentally in-person events, and that postal voting should really only be when you cannot attend a polling place, whether that be on polling day or early voting. But the numbers just make it too difficult to do any sort of policing around that. You just basically got to go with it, and they say they need to vote by postal, and we take it. So that's the way we go. But there is a real tension there, you're right, around, is this a good thing? And because it wasn't designed, has it just turned out this way? And what are the long-term implications if we go to 60, 70%, and then when do we get to a point where it's just a voting period rather than election day or polling day? The other thing I thought I'd mention in relation to Sven's comments is we've done off and on informality studies at recent elections, and 2019 was the first federal election where deliberate informality actually exceeded accidental informality. Well, assumed deliberate versus assumed accidental, for all the reasons that Sven said. So just an interesting thing there, and that's remained the case in events since, 2022. The informality rate for the referendum appears to be vanishingly small. It turns out that people are actually quite okay with writing yes or no on a ballot paper.
All right, thanks guys. We're going to move on to another theme, and look, it's a really easy theme. It's called Truth in Campaigning and Reporting. one of the things that sparked this is that the Australian Electoral Commission on the website has what they call disinformation register. So before I come back to that, I thought I might invite Sally, perhaps if you could comment on past issues that have arisen in relation to election reporting, election advertising and related matters, and if you could keep it under 3 days.
How long have you got? Yeah, exactly. That disinformation register is a sad, sad thing, isn't it? Like when you read what you have to explain doesn't happen. It's really, yeah, it's sad. Okay, election reporting, and once upon a time we had a media, and particularly when we had an age when we were relying on newspapers, where there were professionally trained journalists in a hierarchy of, you know, news organisations who made their living by being pretty centrist products. You know, you might have some who are a bit this way, a bit that, but Australia's a small population, so the economics of the media were you aimed for sort of the middle, and you didn't alienate Labor voters or Liberal voters, and you tried to be pretty middle of the road, and our papers were pretty middle of the road. We might have had some who were you know, a bit one way or the other, and they were often partisan in their editorials, but they didn't try to alienate people. That business model has gone out the window, and online in particular, there is a market for craziness and disinformation, and some people want to read that type of content, and wherever there's a market, there'll be someone to fulfil it and provide that. This makes it a whole different area for regulation. I mean, newspapers weren't regulated, but those market forces put some pressure on them to be sane, to be factually based, and, you know, generally operate in those parameters, particularly with respect to politics. In terms of television and radio, those were regulated spaces. We had an analogue spectrum. You could only have so many stations. They had to be licensed by the government, so they, you know, had to fulfil requirements in terms of being balanced and fair and reasonable. Online is a wild west of anything goes, and we all know that, but that's putting a whole lot of pressure on politics and electoral systems. And I mean the most recent case about the pencils and people worrying that because we use pencils that will be written, you know, crossed out or rubbed out, and someone will write that. You know, the only way you can counter that kind of craziness is to keep saying and be responsive and say, well, bring a pen, you know, if that's a concern. Or you do videos and show this is what happens when the ballots go in the box, and here we are pulling them out, and see how there's always people around. It's, you know, you're trying to educate people, but it's a different world, and that presents a lot of challenges, which we all know.
So I'm going to ask Nye and Sven in a minute to just talk about generally the relationship between traditional media and electoral commissions, but then the emerging sort of challenges, reflecting on what Sally just said. Before that though, Sven, can we go back to this disinformation register? Why? What are the challenges and what's the feedback?
Yeah, we've got one as well.
Oh, right, okay. Well,
on
you
the
jump
VEC
in.
website, and yeah, it's quite similar in concept to what the AEC does, because it makes sense, and it is a very sad indictment. You know, it's like when you see some, I don't know, an instruction on a paper wrapper for a toothpick or something, going, well, this is what we've come to, and well, here we have as well. We have to say these things, and it feels sad that we have to say it, but we have to say it. And it's interesting always to sort of think about, with mis and disinformation, about who our audience is. Now, at one level, of course, it's everyone, but sort of digging into it a little bit more, there's going to be a cohort out there, and I'd hate to put a number on it, but it'd be very small in terms of percentage, that you can't reach because they're so far down some rabbit hole, and that they see everything through a conspiracy lens no matter what, and it's a preconceived idea and so on. Now, that's a very small cohort. Substantial, but percentage small. Yes, they have to be able to reach our information as well, but it's not going to have an effect on them, frankly. You've then got sort of at the other end of the spectrum, you've got a fairly large cohort, maybe not a majority, but a large cohort that sort of is well informed, is calm, looks for appropriate, reliable sources and forms evidence-based opinions. And then between those two is probably where most people are, and they're the ones we really have to reach. because they're the ones that if they get in their feed something from the tiny proportion of everything's a conspiracy of our population, who also have rights and need to be recognised as a real part of our society. But if they get something from them in their feed that says, oh, look, I just saw someone, they said that the AEC or the VEC rubs this out and does this or whatever, and some complete misinformation. If they get that, and there's nothing from us that actually says, well, calmly, here's what the facts are, you can check that out, then there is a danger that they will go from that middle cohort into, over time, that small cohort at the extreme. So we have to be aware of who we're trying to reach. Ultimately, yes, everyone, we don't want to exclude anyone from these messages, but we have to be realistic as to who's likely to actually look at that and who is likely to be affected by it. We always have to have the facts out there as a reliable source so that then we can actually very hands-on and very deliberately address that. And I love the way that the AEC register so pithily says, here's the bit of misinformation, the AEC, is on the side of this, or the AEC does that, quite confronting words. And then, of course, immediately followed by, well, here's what actually happens. And we've got to keep doing that. It's not all we can do, but it's something we have to keep doing.
Perhaps before Nye jumps in, if I can have a supplementary to that, how resource intensive is it, though, to have to make those decisions about, okay, here's a piece of information, that's just political information that candidates should sort out in the public forum. Here's something that, oh yeah, actually we as the Commission have to step in. I mean, that must be a bit resource intensive.
Look, it is, but not overly, to be frank. I think we're getting really good at it. Like the people that we have doing this job in a commission, they're really smart, skillful people. And they can do that pretty readily. And just to unpick that point a bit, it's a really valid one. For example, in any election that we administer, there will be mis and disinformation about candidates and policies. A policy will be put up by a candidate to say, if I get in, I will do X. And it may be very easily verifiable that that is going to be completely unconstitutional. Now, it's not our job to point that out. It might be their competitors, their opposition candidates who should point that out, or the media and all of that sort of thing. Not our job. On the other hand, if there's misinformation saying if you're only allowed to vote in a Victorian election if you've lived in the same address for 10 years or something like that, well, then that's squarely within our bailiwick. So, and there's lots of grey in between, but as I said, we've got really skillful staff at the VEC, and I'm sure it's similar with Nye, who can do that sort of stuff and do it quickly and to a very high standard.
Nye.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing about the disinformation register is it's one small part of a much bigger piece, puzzle. Yes, we need to document where that disinformation is, and you asked the why. I think that's pretty clear. We've seen what happens where trust is lost in electoral bodies. I'd even go out on a limb and say a lot of the challenges that were had in the United States were not actual problems with the system, but problems with trust in the system. From an outsider observing it, that seems to that there are some structural issues that they have, but a lot of what happened in the last event was around that. But it's not just the US, it's around the world. We're seeing this growing trend in mistrust in institutions and a willingness to, if it's complex, it must be wrong. If I don't understand it, that's someone's fault. That being a very small cohort of people, as Sven said, but that can affect others there. But as Sven said also, we're not the arbiters of truth. The elections and referendums are a contest of ideas, and it's not our place to get involved in that. But where it is a question of where rubbing out your votes, or where you have to be enrolled for a period, or if you've been to prison you can't vote. All sorts of things end up on the disinformation register. Disinformation register is part of it, but then communicating out and actively communicating out to address those is the other part of that puzzle, and that's where our engagement in social media comes in, where our work with traditional media comes in, and we can actually get those messages out and actually debunk some of that proactively rather than relying on people coming to our register.
And do you find the media are reasonably cooperative or willing to assist you in that process?
Look, there's always... the interest of the media is an engaging story, and sometimes that isn't boring electoral administration. Who knew? Look, generally, yes. Generally, we are able to get that out, and sometimes it kind of doesn't matter. If I'm going on a radio show to talk about one thing and kind of mention another, then, you know, too bad.
Sally?
Yeah, can I jump in there and say something controversial? So I think it needs to be borne in mind that looking at the United States, which is hard not to bring up in this context as where we don't want it to go, that there is a media company that is a mainstream media company that comes from Australia and owns a lot of newspapers in Australia and a lot of other media, that was one of the major proponents of misinformation in the United States and had a vested interest in distributing that kind of material, and we've seen the consequences, but the consequences came to them in the form of a private company suing them for libel and defamation and getting money out of them. None of that is good for democracy, but sometimes these media companies are no longer... We've crossed into a different world here where they're no longer on the side of democracy, unfortunately, and that is a big, big change from the past. And even this one family that I'm thinking of, has been involved in Australian media for 100 years, and the first proponent of that family, I can't believe, would imagine that descendants would be on the side of anti-democratic things that we have seen come from this company. So we have to be very wary to think that everyone's for information or for a strong democracy, or, again, I'll put myself out on a limb here. There are some people and, parties who prefer to deal with a dictator or a wannabe dictator and one person that they can make a phone call to than a democracy where it's messy and you've got to call lots of people and negotiate with lots of people and you've got to convince the public of different public opinion, and that's harder to do now because there is no strong central sort of media where you can reach everyone at one time, whereas once upon a time you walk down the street here, everyone had a copy of the Herald or whatever it was. So that's harder. It's much easier to have someone who, is beholden to you, that you might have helped them get there, who you can ring up and demand things from, and that's a better case for them than democracy. So we can't imagine anymore that even some of the mainstream media companies are on the side of democracy, and that is a frightening thing.
Okay, well look, another maybe controversial topic, but political donations and public funding. Perhaps a little harder to craft a question here because I think for the VEC and the AEC there are different implications here and different rules. So perhaps what I might do is just ask generally about the extent to which, this is quite a resource-intensive process for you. What are the current challenges? I mean, there's a couple of things here. There's monitoring of donations and the reporting of donations, which it appears to me relies a fair bit on an honesty system as an outsider. But then there's also the issue of public funding of candidates and parties. So that's not a very specific question, but I suspect there's a minefield there waiting. So Sven, would you like to start treading through it first?
Yeah, sure. I'll put on my waders and stride out from shore. Look, I can certainly see some really strong public policy arguments for donations disclosure. I think that's largely uncontroversial. The detail of it, of course, differs and varies and so on. But that's one thing. And another one in terms of public funding. So for people perhaps who don't know, we actually in the VEC, we administer 3 types of what could broadly be called funding for political parties and members. One is administrative expenditure funding, which we spend about $6 million or so, and that goes to parties and candidates who are elected to run their office. It's not for anything that can be used for. It's for running the office, not for electioneering. There's public funding, and we do that about $6 million a year. Public funding is in the order of about $30 million a year, and that's basically where if you get more than 4% of the vote or are elected, or of course both, you receive a certain amount per first preference vote. And then policy development funding. Now that's a very small part, and in several years it hasn't even happened. No one's applied for it. There is some complication there. There's some complexity there, and for us as the administrator of that funding, there's quite a bit of difficulty there. Now, we're only really in the first electoral cycle of this being done, and there is an expert panel that's going to provide its report to the Parliament. I think it's due to report in December, on how that system is working now. And as you can imagine, we've made a submission to that inquiry, and I'm sure many others have as well, including perhaps some people in the room. We really look forward to that. But what the sort of problems that we're finding are things like being able to recover funding when there is a case to do so, and the Act clearly intends for it to be done. For example, if a person leaves a party or finishes their term early and they had been paid in advance, then there is a repayment that has to happen. If we find out from audits and that sort of thing that the money was spent on something it was not allowed to be spent on, then again we can recover that. But all of those cases, A, take resources from us, or require resources of us, I should say, and B, rely on our powers to ask questions, see audits and so on. And that's probably an area, I won't go into the details, quite complex, but that's an area where we've made some recommendations for legislative change to allow us to do that better, more effectively, and to reduce the risk to public funds, because we are talking here about public funds that might be lost and practically unrecoverable, or even legally unrecoverable in a case when they should certainly be recoverable. That's probably just my opening kind of gambit, just to sort of maybe demystify some of the areas of what we're talking about. Apologies to those who already know. Thank you.
Nye.
Yeah, so one of the beautiful things about the structure of the AEC is that I don't actually have to have anything to do with this piece of work. It's all done out of Canberra, but I will make a couple of comments around it. Our structure is a little bit simpler in terms of the funding piece. It's just a ratio per vote over the 4%, same deal there. And that's relatively straightforward to administer. The other piece around the compliance element of it is a real challenge in terms of resources. Trying to secure appropriate staff with the skills in the compliance and regulation space is a real challenge, and as many as you can get, you fill that with work, right? So we could triple the size of that compliance team and have them busy tomorrow. So it is a very, very resource intensive.
And is that just in the donations space, or are there some other spaces I haven't thought of?
Yeah, predominantly in donations and funding. Disclosure and assurance, essentially, we call it. So it's what you're spending your money on, where you're getting it from, basically. And that needs a lot of forensic work. We're very reliant at the moment on voluntary compliance, and then we do audits, and again, working through what happens when those audits do find something, and you've got to unpick some of that. So it's a very, very resource intensive part of our work, and one that I am eternally grateful is done in Canberra.
Sally, is this something you wanted to comment on?
Sure. I'm an academic. I'll talk about anything you throw at me. My question would be why we have public funding. The original intention of it was that as taxpayers we provide money to political parties, they can use that for campaigning, it helps sort of defray their costs, it helps them do research and communicate with us, and because they have that public funding they should be less out there touting for getting donations off lobbyists and big business and people who would try to influence them. I thought that was the original arrangement of why it was provided, but because it's not combined with any requirements of what they do with that funding, and because, correct me if I'm wrong because I haven't looked at this for a while, but there are no caps on election, on donations in terms of what you can raise. You know, if I'm running and someone's giving me lots of private funding, I take that and then I take the public funding as well. So we have no electoral expenditure sort of caps to keep the costs down. We let parties raise money through private donations, and yet we give them public funding as well. So we kind of end up in sort of the worst of all worlds, really, because if we just gave them public funding and said, here's what you get, you're limited to that, but the advantage of this is we stop an arms race where you all madly spend huge amounts of money and then have to, you know, hold dinners where you charge $10,000 a head to speak to some minister or something, well then that seems like a good deal. But if we're just giving public funding as an add-on to all the private donations that they're raising and we're not really telling them how to use it, because we could say, for example, you have to spend it on research or you have to spend it on communication or you must do this, we're just giving them something with nothing much back in the deal for taxpayers and democracy, in my view. So I guess my plea there is that we think about the sort of underlying basis for public funding, why it was introduced and what it was said to be for, but that has been lost in the sort of intervening years, that rationale, which is a bit of a shame. It had some potential there to rein in some things. I'm happy to be proved wrong if that's not the case.
I might race to our final theme because I suspect there'll be questions that want to be asked from the audience. And it follows on, Sven, from somewhere you were starting to go, which was talking about legislative reform that might be beneficial. So just reflecting, and I might get to media separately with Sally in a second in terms of any reform, but Sven and Nye, for you, are there particular amendments to legislation that you think should be looked at? And I know you have to be careful here because it's a parliamentary decision, but you're obviously the key stakeholder. So are there particular legislative changes or other changes that you think need to be seriously looked at in light of the conversation we've been having?
Yes, many. It's good timing because just yesterday, tabled in Parliament was the VEC's report on the 2022 state election. So we have a legislative obligation in the 12 months after a state election to arrange to be tabled in Parliament a very thorough report on the election and looking at certain particular areas. That was tabled in Parliament yesterday and it has plenty of recommendations. I won't go through them all, there's quite a bit. Quite a few of them are sort of fairly technical. Some of the bigger ones, and look, this sounds entirely self-serving for an electoral commission, and that is that Victoria at the moment has the tightest timeframes for elections in Australia from issue to return of the writ. What that does is it puts us under tremendous pressure to deliver the election, which of course, yes, a fair bit of pressure is to be expected in the sort of role that I or Nye and our colleagues do, absolutely. But when they get to the point where the pressures are so hard, so tough, and there is so little room for error and slippage, you can put an election at risk, which of course is the one thing that we always need to prevent. And to give you an idea, at the last state election, this was sort of put into stark relief when we had, as you can imagine, the printing of materials. The printing of ballot material is crucial. Ballot papers, getting them distributed, and that's actually quite a complex job. As you look at the upper house tablecloth ballot paper, it's a very complex thing. Now, the time between us doing the draw for who appears on the ballot paper in what order after candidates have nominated, and the time to print them is basically a couple of working days before you have to be ready for early in-person voting. Last year, there were only 3 providers that we can rely on to print ballot papers at the quality and the amount that we require in the space that we require it. 3 printing presses we can get access to through external providers. Last year, after we were ready to press go and they started printing, 2 of them failed. So we were sending trucks to New South Wales to get ballots from other, all of that sort of thing, to be ready for day one of early voting. Now, even with 2 out of 3 failing, we got there to the point where we had at every district, we had ballot papers ready to go at the opening of early voting. We didn't get them to every early voting centre in every district, but every district had an early voting centre ready to go on day one. And that's because VEC staff basically worked 48 hours straight without sleep. That's all that did. Now, if we just had an extra day or 2, that risk is reduced. Imagine if the 3rd press had failed. We grind to a halt. And that's not because we have weeks and weeks to do this. Between drawing the ballot and printing it and having it ready is a couple of days. So that to us is the biggest issue, because again, if you have an event like that it fails and the election fails, the cost to confidence in the system is huge, and we've got to guard against that. Very briefly, a couple of others, with mis and disinformation, with behaviour at polling places. We've recommended that there be some ability for the VEC and others on behalf of the VEC to be able to regulate conduct, intimidation, all of those sorts of things. To give you one example of how that can sort of go awry, at the Warrandyte by-election recently, we had what's called a quiet hours voting trial during the pre-voting or the pre-poll period, where we said, people who wish to vote in person, but they're neurodivergent, or they don't like to go out in noisy crowds and all of those sorts of things, but they still want to vote in person, fair enough. We had a 2-hour period on one day out of the 2 weeks to say, for this 2-hour period, candidates and volunteers, please don't approach people. Put your materials, your how to vote cards and everything, put that on this table that everyone walks past, but then step back and let them quietly go in, vote and leave, okay? It worked for a few minutes until one person went, this is great, if I harass them, I'll have them all to myself. And then of course all the others went, well not all the others, all but one of the others went, this is great, well we can't let them do this. And so the thing just fell apart. So, I filed that under T for this is why we can't have nice things. But that's an example of the kind of dynamic we're dealing with. And then lots of other things about funding, disclosure, administration, etc. I won't go into now, we haven't got the time. But yes, if anyone wants to have a look on the Parliament website or on our website, it was tabled yesterday and it's full of recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Nye.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I got a copy of that today. That's quite a time. I haven't read it yet, but I'll be looking at it with bated breath. So interestingly, the AEC isn't actually the policy agency for electoral matters. We obviously, as you said, it's a matter for the Parliament, but the Department of Finance has the policy function for electoral matters in federal government. So we obviously consult pretty heavily, or get consulted pretty heavily on implementation. But what it means broadly, it's not a terrible thing because a lot of controversial policy decisions are somewhat removed from us, which is lovely. But what it does mean is that everything that we tend to put forward is a mechanical piece around actually this would be more efficient, or this would be better. We don't get into the this is better for Australian democracy kind of discussion, as much as many of us would love to. Just give us a few drinks on a Friday night and we'll tell you all about it. But what it basically means is we look at those mechanical changes that would make improvements to what we do. And again, as much as I'd love to throw out a whole lot of things that we're pushing for at the moment, there is a little bit of sensitivity around that. So I thought what might be useful is to give an example of some recent things that we had pushed forward that have come through. So
Great.
one of the big changes recently, which is something that the VEC has had for a while, is the ability to open pre-poll ballot boxes before 6 p.m. on polling day. Sort, we don't count, but we sort to candidates, or to, in the case of the referendum, to yes, no, and informal. Do the piles, and then we can get straight into counting as soon as 6 o'clock hits. Now, that seems like we got it from 4 o'clock. I think we asked for earlier and ended up with 4 o'clock. I think you've got like 8 o'clock or something like that in the morning, or yeah, and
part of the
yeah.
Yes.
So that's a real game changer for us, because with that increase in early voting, we've got polling centres. Ballarat pre-poll voting centre in the referendum took just over 30,000 votes. And so trying to get through a 30,000 count when you can't open that ballot box until 6 p.m. is actually getting really challenging, and has a major impact on safe work hours for our staff, and also just getting the result in time. So that was a big one for us. That took a lot of work to get everybody comfortable that that was something that was safe to do, and then getting that through. Similarly, being able to do the same with postal votes that are returned prior to polling day. We can extract them from the envelope ready to be counted from the Monday prior to polling day. So there are a couple of those mechanical things that we've worked through. There's a couple of other bits and pieces. Postal voting's a big one for us. So we got some legislative change that we worked through. You have to fill out your declaration on a postal vote. Sorry, I'm going into kind of, postal vote nerdism here, but you have to fill out your details so that we can determine whether you are on the roll on the outside of your postal vote, which in postal vote certificate envelope, which means you're sending that back through the post with a whole lot of private information on it, and that really worried a lot of people doing that. The other challenge that we had was the Act specifically said that if the ballot paper wasn't in that envelope and was sealed, we had to disregard it. Just couldn't count it, couldn't touch it. So it meant that if we said, okay, put it in an outer envelope, and it wasn't inside the envelope, so we tried that first, and then lots came back and we had to throw lots out. So we did a complete redesign of that certificate process, so it went into an outer envelope. We got legislative change so that we could still count the vote even if it wasn't inside the certificate, which actually had massive savings in terms of people actually being franchised there. So these are the sorts of changes that we're going for, where we can see that there's a challenge with either the delivery of the election or a challenge to franchise. The postal voting system that we had was disenfranchising people because they weren't putting a ballot paper in an envelope properly, and that's ridiculous. When we talk right back at the beginning of this about, it's compulsory voting, so we've got to do everything we can to make it easier, then saying, and if you get this one thing wrong, we're going to throw away your vote, just doesn't play. So they're the sorts of things that we're pushing. The other thing I thought I'd mention here is the sometimes unintended consequences of legislative change. So one of the things that the VEC has recently got as part of the legislation that we would absolutely love to get is a prohibition on third parties sending out postal vote applications. It's one of those things that it's probably the single most complained about thing that we do in a electoral event, and we have no control over it. We encourage people to deal directly with us, but you know, in Victoria, both parties generally do a full mailbox drop to every single household in Victoria, and so yeah, it's a bit there. We would love to have some restrictions around that, at least so that they had to come directly back to us, even if it was still that they can send them out there, because, you know, political parties in Australia are not subject to the Privacy Act. Most people don't know that, but it is a big thing. So there is the potential that parties may be harvesting that information. I couldn't speculate, of course.
I think you're being very generous by saying they may.
So one of the things we would love is to get the legislation that the VEC got to limit that in some way. The unintended consequence, though, that came out there was we've got another type of postal voting called general postal voting, where you become a postal voter for every future election while you are on the roll. And with the prohibition on parties being able to send out postal vote applications, they decided to send out general postal voter applications, which take us. Postal vote application maybe takes 30 seconds to process. A general postal voter application takes about 3 minutes to process. So we jumped from, around the state election, we jumped from having a few thousand general postal voters in Victoria to having hundreds of thousands in Victoria. This isn't a criticism of any of the legislation, it's just a comment about needing to be really, really careful about unintended consequences when you are changing an act that has never had a wholesale review and is just being tinkered with bits and pieces along the way.
Okay, thanks. I must admit, when we developed that theme, I didn't realise there was going to be such an outpouring of legislative change. Sally, I had also mentioned any changes to media laws or regulations that should take place. Is there anything you wanted to add there? And I'm mindful that we want to get some questions in.
I can be very brief on this because when we're talking about online information, there's very little in the way of regulation or legislation that can do anything here. The only counter to disinformation is education and information. So, you know, I was dreading this question because I have nothing constructive to add in terms of regulation or legislation that can help. And most of this that we're talking about, this, you know, misinformation, disinformation is coming from the online sphere, and there's very little we can do other than fight it through every time we see it. And but on the good side of that is that every time we have a well-run election and people go in and they have a good experience and they see the results and they have confidence and there's trust there, that builds a certain amount of goodwill and strength in our system that is there. But the worry is that things like you're just describing, where it's out of your control, where ballots are going back to parties, you know, anything that's in the system that could be a slight area.
I just need to do a bit of a disinformation register piece. The ballots don't go back to the parties. It's just the postal application.
The postal application. My mistake there, my disinformation there. When the postal applications go back to the parties, or any is out of the Electoral Commission's realm, any part in the system that could go wrong but will be blamed on you and the Electoral Commissions and the system is a problem, because it only takes little chinks to start weakening the system, and we want to crack down on all of those potential things. And you know, that is the sort of best antidote to misinformation, is good experiences. And generally Australians do have really good experiences, and we see overseas long queues and bad practices, and I think a lot of people really understand that our system works very well, and we want to keep it that way. So.
Great, thank you. And my apologies to the audience, I've not managed the time brilliantly. Over to questions. And we have got a few members of Parliament in the audience, and because of houses and commitments, if a member of Parliament has a question, maybe please feel free to put your hand up and I'll give you priority, because I know you'll have chamber duties. Tim Reid.
I'll be very quick, and thank you for your comments so far. A couple of quick questions about relating to is informal voting less common in jurisdictions that don't have compulsory attendance voting? And can you see a way of improving it with something like, I'm thinking here about accidental or inadvertent informal voting, whether something like electronic, you can't withdraw money by mistake so much because you're told what you're about to withdraw, that kind of thing, whether there be some sort of electronic prompting that fix that.
Yeah, look, on the first question, I don't have that data to hand, but between the difference in formality rates with compulsory and not. Not sure about that. One thing that I can say from our study so far is that, unsurprisingly, is that the more candidates on a ballot paper, the more informality there is. Which makes sense if you have to number every box. So, and there seems to be quite a strong sort of inflection point, somewhere around sort of 8, 9, 10 candidates, maybe anything more than that, and the formality rate kind of skyrockets. And that's something that we've seen in Victoria. To give you an idea, at the last state election, over 1,100 candidates at the Victorian state election, lower and upper house. You go back a few elections and that was half that. So you can imagine that the ballot papers themselves are increasing in complexity, and yet our informality rates have not gone up that much. And in fact, the last state election was the first time that they went down in a long time. So even though numbers went up, informality went down. So that's a little bit encouraging. Only went down a little bit, but we'll take it for now. On the first point, I'm not sure. Second one, on the whether you can sort of have some sort of verification, like if I can interpret what you're saying as like, could you have, you fill in your ballot, you don't vote electronically, you fill in your ballot paper, but then you put it under some sort of camera and it says, yep, valid. It recognised that. I'm not aware of anything like that having been trialled or considered or anything like that. Of course, if you went to full electronic, like, internet-based voting, which is a huge topic. I don't want to go there because we'll be here for weeks. But if you had something like that, clearly that is one of the benefits of an electronic system, because clearly there will be a submit button, and if your vote is informal, it would come up either saying, no, you can't submit it because it's informal, or it would say, do you realise this is informal? Are you sure you want to submit it? But that's a huge topic for another day. Maybe.
Just quickly, upper house versus lower house informality.
I'm sorry, I haven't got that to hand. But of course, with the upper house, so many people vote above the line, so I don't think the difference is all that big, frankly. I would imagine that of the cohort that chooses to vote below the line, there's probably more informality because that's a lot of boxes. But I don't think there's that much difference at the moment, given A, you can vote above the line, and B, below the line voting has been made easier to get right, put it that way.
Just what I'd add, I don't have the comparison to jurisdictions that are non-compulsory either, but I guess the comment I'd make around that is that we are talking relatively small amounts of informality, which remains relatively static. I think it's gone down slightly for you. For us, it's stayed pretty static for federally there, but we're talking single-digit percentages. 5-6%. So if we're saying that around 50% of informality is deliberate informality, apparent deliberate informality, that would be what I would expect to disappear if you didn't have compulsory voting, potentially. Excluding those who are sending a message, not sure quite to who, but to our researchers, that would be my comment on that one.
Okay, so again, if there's any members who have a question, otherwise I'll just go to the rest of the audience. And I was wondering if Bridget Noonan was going to jump up and barrack for Sven when he talked about the timelines for the writ and what have you, because it was always a nightmare for parliamentary officers and members of Parliament too, with the proximity of an opening of Parliament to the writ coming back. But I'll open it up to other people for any questions. Ken?
I have a number of capacities, but currently I'm not an office holder within the party, but I'm a member of it. One of the things that has struck me about the Victorian regulatory regime is that it's pretty difficult to manage at the local branch level, at the level where you've got 20 or 30 people meeting once a month and trying to run a campaign at election time. Do either of the electoral commissions work with the parties to work on the practicality of implementing the legislation?
Well, we certainly work with the parties as part of the process of us administering it. We have to. And from that, we get feedback. That's one point. And I can see the points that you're making, which would be experienced, I'm sure, by several, all certainly larger parties. What I would recommend in that regard is, given the current inquiry into how these are now working, given that they've only really been through one election cycle, that would be a really good area for a submission. And there may already be one. Apologies if I'm not aware of it, but yes, I would suggest that.
Julia.
It's more of a comment than a question, and it's about the AEC actually. During the 2022 federal election, I reckon the AEC Twitter account was one of the best Twitter accounts around. Because
Me too.
Not only did it correct misinformation and disinformation, but it was funny as well. They were really funny guys.
It's actually a really interesting one, that, because even in 12 months there's been such change in that space, particularly around with Twitter, but just generally in the social media accounts. I go back, social media space more generally. We go back to 2022, we had direct relationships with all of the major social media organisations. They were very responsive. We could generally get things like doxing of our staff and stuff taken down very, very quickly. And there was a general feeling from all of the majors that, hey, we're here to help and get involved. They didn't get it right all the time, but there was generally a sense that they were all trying to assist. I don't know what's changed in terms of the market piece there, because it isn't just Twitter that's changed. We are finding it much, much more difficult to get, identification of our staff, threats to our staff, that sort of stuff, taken down on any of the platforms now than we had previously. And yeah, I don't have an answer to exactly what that is. I don't think it can all be Elon.
It can be a fair bit, but then the others have to follow, because if one platform sort of strips its resourcing of that area to become more lean and profitable, then the others will probably be under pressure to do so as well. We've had exactly the same experience with the platforms, one of the things that we've done as ECAN, so the Electoral Council of Australia and New Zealand, which is all of the electoral commissioners from, as you would expect, Australia and New Zealand, we at our one of the actions from our last meeting was that we wrote to the E-Safety Commission as well, and we're engaging with her office because they obviously have protocols with the platforms and so on for exactly these sorts of things, and our staff have experienced that as well, where people at polling stations will film particular polling workers and film their cars and follow them home and all. It's awful stuff, and then post that, and with a wink of basically trying to attack this person effectively. So but we're experiencing the same sort of challenges. So we've just got to work together on that and keep it going. But really, please, I agree with your observation about the AEC social media as well, and we're taking some lessons from that as well. And it's a bit tricky, because when you do things like that and you do it in an engaging and entertaining way, which you kind of have to be relevant, it makes for fairly easy fodder of, why you're spending money on this instead of, printing ballot papers and that sort of thing, which, usually when that criticism is made, it doesn't get much traction, but it's what we're up against. But I completely agree. I think we've got to do it, we've got to engage, and we've got to be quick. If there's misinformation on that platform, one of our people can get straight on there and say, nope, that's wrong, here's where it is, here's the source. Right then, it can't be a media release 2 weeks later. That's not the world anymore.
Just the other thing on that is the risk has increased. So that tone of being a little bit humorous, a little bit informal and so forth is absolutely required to cut through. But where you've got a multiple chain of, back and forward, it's really easy to end up with one comment taken out of context.
Yep, that's right.
And, probably people can think what I'm talking about here, but, it can really be taken out of context and be completely blown out of proportion, and suddenly the AEC is basically saying you don't have to vote, or you can vote multiple times, and you can't. It's against the law, so I'm not taken out of context.
Sally, did you want to jump in there at all into... I guess it's the other way of looking at it. We've been talking about how there's all these problems with media, but now the commissions are talking about also using social media in a positive way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I recognise the challenges, and the environment is changing. I guess it goes back to what I said before about civics and education, that we'd all hope that people would have a good, strong base from when they're younger, so that when they hear this stuff when they're older, they can just immediately dismiss that, or they can say to someone older in their family, this stuff isn't right, I know this. And, how to get that base in there and make it more interesting, and being lighthearted and engaging and making us sort of proud of what we have in Australia, I think is a real strength, and sort of communicating that is important, because people need to have that base and that confidence, and I think that's generally been there and been strong, but we can see that it can be chipped away, and little things can chip away at it and be magnified into something outrageous, and it's quite amazing that we haven't had anything, touch wood, it wouldn't take much to start, those kind of things off, and I just hope that base stays strong, and it needs to be there from a younger age, yeah.
And Sally, when you talk within academic circles, which tends to happen these days around the world, and in your own research, have you picked up any sort of perceptions overseas of how our commissions are seen?
I tend to talk more about the media these days than, but I think we have a great reputation, and we're always considered a sort of world leader in this sort of thing, and our speed and reaction time in setting up the sort of timeframes you're describing before, I think that would be the envy of most places in the world, to be able to have that sort of speed and thoroughness. We're a good operation, and people, I think, generally understand that. And the way we're talking about people doing pre-poll votes or other votes, I mean, we give people many opportunities to engage with the system. We require it of them, and I just hope that they understand why we want that. And getting that message across is really important, that this is for everyone. This is not, we don't want to see just some people voting, and we want everyone to vote. And there's always going to be some people who don't, which is why informal voting is higher. And going back to Tim's question, yes, in research that I did years ago, we have higher informal voting because people who don't want to vote, the ones we're capturing and requiring it of them, will either leave the ballot blank or, not fill it in correctly. And in other systems, it's quite simple. It's a cross, just one cross and you're done. Ours requires sequential numbering, and it's a bit harder. So, informal voting is kind of the price we pay for a very thorough, comprehensive system that captures as many people as possible. It's more worrying when we get more deliberate than accidental, because they used to be mainly accidental. So that's a sort of change we need to keep an eye on, but because the roles are so thorough. But yeah, there's a lot of good, I think, that can be taken from this, but it is a very challenging environment and a new playing field. Yeah.
Thank you. If there's no further questions, what I might do is ask everyone if you could please thank our three panel members.